This is J'Ba Fofi, a giant spider cryptid that is said to dwell deep within the Congolese forest.
In the deepest rainforests of Congo, villagers speak quietly about one creature they refuse to call a legend, the J'Ba Fofi, a spider so large its webs can block jungle trails.
The J'Ba Fofi, or the giant or great spider. Their vivid descriptions depicted these spiders as predominantly brown with a distinctive purple marking on their abdomen.
And its hunts leave nothing but white bones in the trees. For decades, missionaries, soldiers, and hunters have told the same impossible story.
But the people here say this jungle is home to something else. Monster spiders.
And been dismissed as liars or victims of fever. Then a trained arachnologist followed their warnings into the forest and discovered the truth. Encounters the world tried to ignore. The first warnings about the giant J'Ba Fofi spider came from people who vanished, barely survived, and people who saw something so large and unnatural that authorities refused to believe them. The earliest recorded incident took place in 1938 near the Ituri forest, when a missionary team reported what they described as a ground-shaking web stretched across a narrow jungle trail. The missionaries were familiar with large insects and dangerous animals, but nothing prepared them for threads that looked like thick white ropes and vibrated with a force that could be felt several feet away. That night, 3 members of the group disappeared. They did not wander off, and they did not get lost. Their belongings were still at camp, and the ground showed clear drag marks leading away from the tents. The only survivor was a man named Robert Hale. He could barely speak and only repeated one detail. He said he saw a shadow that moved like many arms lowering itself from the trees. Colonial officers dismissed his account and marked it as a fever hallucination caused by malaria. Yet the officers still collected pieces of a strange silk from the site. The samples were quietly archived and never investigated further. Another disturbing encounter occurred in the early 1940s. A Congolese soldier serving with the Belgian military staggered into his outpost in a state of shock. His uniform was covered in thick silk fibers. Medical staff reported that he could not move his legs for several hours due to what they described as instant paralysis. They tested his blood and found traces of venom, but the toxin did not match any known spider. Belgian forces then sealed off the surrounding area for half a year. The reason for the closure was never explained to the public. Local hunters have their own accounts. Members of the Baka community reported finding monkeys that had dropped dead without any visible wounds. When they looked closer, the monkeys were wrapped in thin silk layers that were almost invisible until touched. The bodies were partially drained as if something had fed on them. In another case, a young child wandered away from a village and did not return. The search party found torn clothing beside a large depression in the mud. The impression looked like a footprint, but it was wider than any human track and deeper than any mark left by a gorilla. Scientists in the early 20th century ignored these reports. Western researchers claimed the stories were exaggerations or folklore. This attitude remained even when early explorers documented webs large enough to block entire footpaths. One zoologist in the 1920s wrote in his notes that he often felt heavy vibrations above him, as if something large moved from branch to branch. He assumed it was a monkey, but the pattern of movement did not match any known primate. His notes were archived but never investigated. If the earliest witnesses described the same monster again and again, the real question becomes what the forest tribes knew that outsiders refused to understand. The legend the tribes refused to speak fully. For generations, the Baka and Mbuti communities have lived with the knowledge that something enormous moves through the rainforest. They do not treat the J'Ba Fofi as a legend or a teaching tool. They treat it as a real animal with rules, patterns, and reactions that must be respected. When outsiders first hear the name, they assume it is the only word the tribes use. Elders quickly explain that J'Ba Fofi is a softened version meant for travelers. The real name is used only inside controlled gatherings during daylight because speaking it after dark is believed to attract the spider. This belief is based on the idea that the creature can detect sound vibrations over long distances. The tribes follow unspoken rules that seem simple on the surface but are rooted in survival. Certain walking paths are avoided completely, not because of superstition but because those paths are known for sudden and complete silence. Hunters say that when birds, insects, and frogs all stop making noise at the same time, a large predator is present. Silence in the rainforest is never natural, so those areas are considered part of the spider's territory. Villagers do not challenge this. They simply reroute their lives around the danger. Another practice involves leaving offerings under specific trees. These gifts usually include small pieces of meat or fruit. The tribes insist this is not worship. It is a sign of respect meant to make the spider ignore human presence. Elders explain that generations ago these offerings reduced the number of unexplained disappearances. Whether or not this explanation is accurate, the practice continues without question. Stories about the so-called Mother Guardian show how deep this belief runs. According to the tribes, the massive spider described by hunters is always a female. They say she controls a wide territory that stretches through parts of the forest that outsiders rarely enter. Smaller spiders act as scouts, watching trails and warning the larger one when prey enters her range. This is the first time any account from the region suggests that the species may show group behavior. The tribes do not consider this unusual. To them, it is simply how the forest works. There is one story that even the elders hesitate to speak about because they believe it proves exactly what the J'Ba Fofi is capable of. They call it the Night of the White Bones. It describes a hunting party that entered a clearing deep inside restricted territory and realized they had stepped into the feeding ground of the giant spider. Dozens of skeletons hung from trees in half-finished cocoons, wrapped in thick silk identical to the strands the tribes associate with the J'Ba Fofi. The bodies were not old. Some still had pieces of flesh attached, which meant the spider had been feeding recently and would likely return. The hunters fled without taking anything, and the entire village now treats that clearing as a forbidden zone. No one has entered it since. When asked why these details were not widely shared with researchers in the past, the elders provide a simple answer. Outsiders who went searching for the spider often disappeared. Speaking too much about the creature was believed to draw attention, and attention meant danger. Guided by these warnings, Thomas Avery, a trained arachnologist, traveled to the Congo to investigate the unusual web formations. The web that should not exist. Thomas Avery already understood from the tribes that the J'Ba Fofi used enormous webs to hunt, but nothing prepared him for the scale and complexity of the structure he found deep inside the forest. The web stretched close to 3 meters from tree to tree. Every line looked unnaturally thick, almost like fishing wire. When Thomas lifted his machete to test the tension, the blade bent slightly instead of cutting through. This was the first time he realized he was dealing with a material that exceeded the strength of known spider silk. Thomas collected several strands and later confirmed through portable field equipment that the silk contained unusual protein chains that could bind to trace metals in the soil. This made the thread stronger and more elastic than anything recorded in arachnology. The web also showed signs that the spider was feeding recently. Thomas examined the silk and found feathers that were partially dissolved. He found bird bones that had been snapped into clean sections, which suggested a predator strong enough to break bones swiftly. A dried leg from a small antelope species called a duiker still hung from one corner. There was also a torn scrap from what looked like a human shirt caught near the lower section of the web. These discoveries indicated a wide diet range that included animals much larger than typical spider prey. It also raised serious questions about recent disappearances in nearby regions. Another detail alarmed Thomas. The faint, sweet scent that the villagers spoke about was present around the web. He analyzed the smell with a handheld detection device and found chemical markers consistent with pheromones. This meant the scent was not random. It was a deliberate method the spider used to mark territory or communicate with others of its kind. Thomas had set up motion sensing cameras earlier in the expedition. When he reviewed the footage after discovering the web, he saw something that made him freeze. One recording captured a large appendage, thicker than a human arm, brushing the outer threads. It did not resemble a monkey limb or the leg of any known mammal. Another camera showed repeated tremors moving through the web with slow, heavy intervals. These tremors suggested a creature with a massive body weight shifting its position nearby. While collecting samples, Thomas accidentally touched a coated section of silk with his wrist. Within seconds, his skin began to redden and sting. He washed the area immediately. A later chemical analysis revealed that the silk carried active digestive enzymes. These enzymes begin breaking down tissue the moment prey is captured. This meant the spider did not always wait to inject venom. The silk itself could start the feeding process while the prey was still alive. The details from the discovery made it clear that this web was not simply a trap. It acted as a chemical weapon and a biological extension of the creature's hunting system. Every part of it was designed to weaken, confuse, or dissolve prey, but the web was only the warning. What came next proved that the J'Ba Fofi was not avoiding humans. It was studying them. The attack in the canopy. Thomas Avery continued deeper into the rainforest with his guide Enoshi, hoping to document more evidence of the J'Ba Fofi. They moved slowly and stayed alert because the forest felt different now. The air was heavy. The insects were quiet. Even the leaves seemed still. Thomas raised his camera to capture the layout of the trees, but before he could begin filming, he heard a sharp crack above his head. It sounded like a thick branch snapping under weight. Another crack followed, then a rapid shaking in the canopy. Something large was moving through the upper layers of the forest. Thomas aimed his flashlight upward. The beam only reached the lower branches, but the movement continued higher. Suddenly, a massive shadow dropped through the leaves. The force of its descent shook nearby trees and knocked loose debris across a wide circle. Leaves rained down in clumps. Thomas stumbled back as the shape landed on a branch thick enough to support a person. The creature stood still at first. When the leaves finally settled, he saw it clearly. The legs were impossibly long, like strong wooden limbs stretching outward in multiple directions. The body was the size of a grown man's torso, swollen and heavy. Its eyes reflected the light with a faint golden shimmer. Thomas realized that the spider was watching him directly. It showed no confusion and no hesitation. Its posture resembled that of a predator evaluating a target. The spider moved without warning. It pushed forward with incredible speed and released a burst of silk that shot through the air like a rope. The silk struck Thomas on the shoulder with enough force to knock him sideways. The impact surprised him because he had never known silk could be fired with such strength. The contact burned through his shirt immediately. He felt intense heat on his skin as the venom in the silk began reacting with the fabric. Enoshi grabbed Thomas by the arm and pulled him back while shouting for him to move. They rushed toward a cluster of trees for cover. Thomas looked over his shoulder and expected the creature to chase them, but it did not move from its position. Instead, it crouched lower on the branch and kept its eyes fixed on them. It did not look confused or startled. Its behavior looked intentional, as if the strike had been delivered to test distance, reaction time, or strength. The spider remained motionless for several seconds. Then it slowly moved backward into the canopy. It did not flee and it did not hide. It simply returned to the branches at a controlled pace while maintaining eye contact for as long as possible. Thomas realized the creature was studying them rather than attacking for food. Later, he wrote in his field notes that the spider moved with restraint. He said this frightened him more than aggression because it suggested decision-making rather than instinct. A predator that tests its prey is far more dangerous than one that attacks blindly. This attack shattered any idea that the creature was simply a giant animal. Thomas needed answers, and the biology of the monster revealed horrors evolution should never have allowed. Biology of a monster. Thomas Avery expected the J'Ba Fofi to be dangerous, but he assumed the tribes understood the creature better than anyone. The deeper he studied its biology, the clearer it became that even the elders had only seen the surface of what this species could do. The legends were warnings based on fear, but the scientific evidence pointed to something far worse. This was not a giant spider with unusual strength. This was a predator shaped by evolution in ways that defied normal limits. Thomas began with the feeding pattern. The tribe's stories claimed the spider fed rarely, and his research confirmed this. The J'Ba Fofi had an extremely low metabolic rate, which allowed it to survive on only 3 or 4 major kills each year. This meant the creature could remain motionless for long periods while waiting for a target to wander into its territory. What the tribes did not know was what happened after the prey was captured. The venom caused total paralysis within minutes, but it did not shut down awareness. Prey often remained conscious for hours while the spider fed. The J'Ba Fofi dissolved tissue externally and consumed it slowly, which meant victims experienced the entire process without the ability to move or call for help. Further analysis of the silk revealed a second layer of horror that the legends never described. The venom carried compounds that interfered with the brain. These compounds produced confusion, fear, and vivid hallucinations. This explained why many villagers spoke of spirits or strange figures moving through the trees during attacks. They were not seeing supernatural beings. They were experiencing the neurological side effects of the venom while the spider held them in place. Victims did not simply die from the bite. Their senses were broken down one by one, leaving them trapped between awareness and paralysis while the spider fed at its own pace. The structure of the J'Ba Fofi's body also contradicted everything known about spiders. The exoskeleton fragments Thomas recovered were reinforced with mineral deposits. This gave the shell bone-like strength and allowed the spider to withstand impacts from large mammals. Tribes believed the spider avoided confrontation, but Thomas learned it avoided conflict because it had learned more effective hunting methods, not because it lacked strength. Thomas also found impressions in the soil near the camp. Each night the marks moved closer. The spider was not wandering. It was tracking them. Its movements changed in response to the team's behavior. It avoided cameras. It circled downwind. It approached silently when the team rested and withdrew when they moved. This indicated deliberate observation. Everything Thomas discovered proved one terrifying truth. The J'Ba Fofi was not simply a legend misunderstood by outsiders. It was a species evolving intelligence, strategy, and awareness in ways no one predicted. Still shaken, Thomas and Inoshi pushed deeper into the forest. What they found next proved the legend wrong in the worst possible way. The nest no human was meant to find. Thomas Avery believed he was tracking a single creature. Every clue suggested one enormous predator that lived alone in a vast territory. That belief collapsed the moment he and Inoshi followed a pattern of disturbed soil to a section of the forest where several large trees had fallen in the same direction. At first, it looked like simple storm damage. Then Thomas noticed the ground beneath the trunks was hollow. The collapse had exposed an opening in the earth, and warm air pulsed upward from the darkness. Thomas felt the temperature rise as he approached. The heat was not natural. It suggested a controlled environment maintained by something alive inside. They lowered themselves into the opening and reached a chamber that stretched far beneath the forest floor. The moment Thomas's light struck the walls, he realized the legend had failed to prepare him for what he was seeing. Dozens of enormous silk sacks lined the chamber. Each sack was roughly the size of a pumpkin. Thomas counted more than 40 before he stopped. A number of them were slit open. Others showed signs of hatching. Silk trails led up the walls and disappeared into cracks that connected to the surface. This meant the spiders were not only reproducing, they had already begun leaving the nest. Thomas moved the beam of his flashlight again and saw movement at the far end of the chamber. Several shaped figures emerged from the shadows and began circling. These were not adults, yet even in their smaller size they were large enough to kill a human. Their bodies reached the height of a man's waist. Their movements were coordinated. The spiders shifted left and right at the same time before slowly tightening the circle. This level of group behavior showed that cooperation was not limited to adults. It was a natural part of the species' development. As Thomas backed away, he nearly stepped on something that made him stop. Partially buried in the soil was a torn boot. Next to it lay a cracked lens from a camera. A few inches farther were splintered human bones arranged in a semicircle. The bones were white and clean, a sign that enzymes had removed all organic tissue. There were too many to belong to a single victim. Thomas counted several femurs and ribs. Someone had placed them deliberately after feeding. It became clear that the nest had been visited by humans long before him and Enosh, and none had escaped. Once Thomas understood the structure of the forest above, the behavior of the giant webs finally made sense. A large section of trees surrounding the nest was wound with tripline webs. These were not random traps. They were designed to guide prey toward the underground chamber. When prey hit the triplines, vibrations traveled through the ground and alerted the spiders. The forest was not only a hunting ground, it was a funnel directing living creatures into the nest where juveniles could feed and grow. The realization changed everything Thomas believed about the legend. The tribes had warned of one guardian because they assumed the sightings pointed to a single creature. The truth was far worse. The J'Ba Fofi was not a lone survivor of a forgotten species. It was part of a breeding colony hidden beneath one of the most remote forests in the world. Terrified and overwhelmed, Thomas understood that revealing this discovery could start widespread panic or provoke attempts to capture the species. He also knew he needed to leave before the spiders closed the circle completely. However, escaping the forest would prove far more complicated than entering it. The cover-up that proves it exists. Thomas Avery believed escaping the forest would bring safety. He believed returning to base camp would give him time to organize his notes, preserve the samples he collected, and send a warning to the scientific community. Instead, the moment he reached camp, he realized something was terribly wrong. Several storage containers were open. His notebooks were scattered. The memory cards from his primary camera were missing. Even the hard case he used for backup storage had been emptied. No signs of forced entry were visible. Someone had gone through everything quietly and with purpose. Thomas activated his satellite communicator to call for evacuation, but the device would not power on. Hours earlier, it had been fully charged. He checked the battery, the wiring, and every setting, yet nothing responded. It was as if the device had been remotely disabled. His chemical samples were also disturbed. The vials containing silk residue had been removed from their foam slots. Whoever tampered with his equipment knew exactly what they were looking for. Before Thomas could attempt to leave on foot, several Congolese officials arrived at the camp. They offered no explanation for their presence and asked no questions about his work. They insisted he accompany them immediately. When he asked if he was under investigation, they refused to respond. They escorted him out of the region and seized the remainder of his research under the claim of environmental protection. He was not given any documentation or return date for his materials. Once the officials placed him on transport out of the rainforest, communication stopped completely. Thomas tried to contact Enoshi for answers, but the guide refused every request for conversation. Thomas suspected Enoshi had been warned to stay off. Rumors soon circulated that fragments of Thomas's research had slipped into private channels. A single surviving image was mentioned repeatedly. It was not in high detail. It did not show the full creature. It showed a large shadow positioned behind Thomas during one of his field recordings. Witnesses claim it clearly showed 3 shapes, not one. The frame was quickly removed from circulation. No one would confirm where it came from or who suppressed it. Authorities continued to deny the existence of the J'Ba Fofi. They claim it is nothing more than folklore and misinterpretation. At the same time, new arguments have begun surfacing. Some people insist that Thomas Avery never existed at all. They claim his name was invented by believers who want to convince the world that the spider is real. Others argue the opposite. They believe Thomas was real and that the government created these doubts to confuse the public and bury his findings. No one agrees on which side is telling the truth. Meanwhile, the forest keeps producing massive webs. The heat signatures keep spreading. People continue to disappear in regions where the tribe's warnings remain unchanged. No one can say which parts of Thomas's research were real and which parts were removed. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more incredible videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.